He is in. Okay then, well, welcome everybody to this Human Rights Council digital side event on ensuring the human rights of children online, examining the role of the private sector. I would start by thanking the sponsors for inviting me, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Permanent Mission of Sweden, the Permanent Mission of the United States, my own organization, the Universal Rights Group, and the Global Child Forum. So I'm Mark Lyman, I'm the Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group. I've become very accustomed to these online human rights events over the past year and a half, so I'm sure this will go very smoothly indeed. Everybody else probably is very well versed in this format as well. The running order today, I'll give a brief introduction, then I will pass to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sweden for introductory remarks, keynote address, and then we will turn to the panelists. I will ask a series of short questions. It will all be very journalistic style, short questions, very short, insightful answers, and then we will turn to questions from the audience, which I will proffer a selection of those questions to each of the panelists. So please, everybody on the call in the meeting, if you could make comments or add questions in the chat box, then my colleagues will be keeping an eye on that and we will make a selection, and some of them we may be able to answer in the chat box directly. So the digital world, as everybody here knows, offers limitless opportunities for everybody, including children who, and the parents amongst us know this very well, are spending more time than ever before online. So there are opportunities there, connecting with peers, through their games, devices, smartphones, and other technologies. But with these opportunities, as always in the digital world, come risks and challenges, whether that's cyberbullying, data breaches, sexual exploitation, or other forms of peer-to-peer violence, which affect young people each time they connect. And this can lead in serious cases, but it's not uncommon, of course, to cases of mental health issues, substance abuse, self-isolation, self-harm, or even suicide. And also more and more children are exposed to hate speech and violent content online. There are also privacy issues that with artificial intelligence, gathering data for use in AI. In many cases, the data involved can be private, such as location information, medical records, and biometric data. And children, of course, may not be fully aware of what they're doing and may disclose too much information, which can lead not only to breaches of privacy, but also risks to the physical safety of children and to criminals. We're speaking today at the Human Rights Council, and it's clear, I think, the UN must necessarily be fully involved if the world is to address these threats to children's rights, while also maximising the benefits and respecting all human rights. Indeed, the Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Secretary General, as well as special procedures, have all touched upon some of these issues in their various resolutions, reports, roadmaps and speeches. The private sector, which is the key focus today, including big tech, is also anybody who watches the news and Facebook and Twitter and the US elections and Donald Trump will know are increasingly engaged on human rights in the digital world. And that indeed, as it should be, the private sector must be part of the solution here if we are to find workable solutions and build a digital world that is put at the service of children's rights. However, the World Benchmarking Alliance's 2020 Digital Inclusion Benchmark findings on child online protection clearly shows there's much more work to be done. The DIB found that only 16 digital companies of the 100 assessed by the benchmark demonstrated a high level commitment to child online protection. With that in mind, today's side event will bring together, or is bringing together, global stakeholders to discuss best practices on child online protection and advocate for transparency, accountability, and leadership on the part of the private sector to make the internet a safe space for children. With that introduction said, I'm now pleased to give the floor to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sweden to the UN office in Geneva, Her Excellency Anna Jordfeldt, who will speak via video.
Let me start by thanking the World Benchmark Alliance and the Universal Rights Group for organizing this important event, which covers several issues central to Sweden's foreign policy priorities, here in Geneva in the Human Rights Council, but also more broadly in our drive for democracy. At the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council, Sweden, together with a core group consisting of Brazil, Nigeria, Tunisia and the United States of America, will once again present a resolution on the promotion, protection and enjoyment of human rights on the Internet. The resolution, when it was first presented in 2012, established that human rights must be protected equally offline and online. As the COVID-19 pandemic and related restrictions have clearly underlined that access to the Internet is crucial for the enjoyment of human rights, this year's resolution will focus on digital divides and the importance of access to an open, free, interoperable, reliable and secure Internet. During this last year, we have seen how the online space has, in some instances, been the only space to exercise the rights to freedom of expression, of access to information, of assembly and association. When education moves to distance learning, access to the Internet becomes a prerequisite for the right to education. Missing out on education, of course, risks having devastating impacts on children's abilities to exercise their rights and for their opportunities later on in life. It is also clearly linked to the issue of child labor. Large parts of the world have, of course, gone through a digital transformation, enabling us to work from home, continue our education, and access medical and healthcare systems. At the same time, those 3.7 billion who do not have access to the Internet have fallen even further behind, resulting in even larger inequalities. The digital divide exists not only between countries, but also within them, where too often women and girls do not have the same access to digital technologies to the same extent as men and boys. Moving forward from the pandemic, we therefore must ensure that no one is left behind. Global cooperation and multilateralism are key to work more on digital connectivity and the digital transformation. All measures relating to the development of the framework, content and common standards of the Internet must ensure a human rights-based approach and take place through a multi-stakeholder cooperation where states, civil societies and also companies are involved. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which have been paramount to set the standard for businesses' responsibilities in relation to human rights. In 2015, Sweden was among the first countries to adopt the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. This action plan incorporates children's rights and business principles and forms the basis for the government's engagement with the business sector. The action plan also makes clear that we expect Swedish businesses to act sustainably and responsibly and to respect human rights. Business activities should neither be contributing to or be responsible for violations or abuses of human rights. Moving forward, the potential for information and communication technologies is significant in theory, but barriers remain when it comes to access and effective use of these tools. Governments and the private sector must address this through innovative technology and new business models to stimulate affordability and improve connectivity. As the Committee of the Rights of the Child recently stated on children's rights in the digital environment, meaningful access to digital technologies can support children to realize their full range of their civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. However, if digital inclusion is not achieved, existing in
I think the end of that video
and digital technologies enable us to communicate, to access information, to engage in democratic processes, and to enjoy our human rights. It has enabled child and youth human rights defenders to raise their voices in the online space, creating global movements for climate justice and the fight against racism, just to name a few examples. Let us keep these examples in mind while we fight to encounter and face the barriers that do still confront us when it comes to moving forward. Thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks to Ambassador Jordfeldt and the Permanent Mission of Sweden for that message. Lots of important messages, especially considering the important work the Human Rights Council is doing in this area. So very positive messages. We'll now move to the interactive panel discussion part of the programme. And we have a really esteemed group of speakers with us today. We have Ms. Mama Fatima Singhat, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. Andrew Mawson, the Chief of the Child Rights and Business Section at UNICEF. Philippa Bergin, Head of Research and Development at the Global Child Forum. Andrew Bouet, who's Vice President of Group Sustainability at Singtel and Optus. And last but not least, and I say that because we're going to start with her, is Lord Montenegro, who's Digital Benchmark Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So, Lord, I think I already saw you with us, so I will go ahead and pose the question, which I'm sure will come as a complete surprise to you what the question is. But anyway, could you please share some insights into the WBA's digital inclusion benchmark and how it connects to the goals of the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 38.7. Sorry. Please, Lord, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Greetings to everyone, excellencies, and all our peers and colleagues and fellow stakeholders and actors working towards human rights. So very pleased to be here today. I'm pretty sure Mark has already foreshadowed some of the findings, but allow me to provide a broader background and overview. As the ambassador has said, digitalization, accelerated by public health necessity during this COVID-19 pandemic, heightens human rights risks and inequalities, reinforcing exclusion of vulnerable groups and underserved communities from being meaningful participants, beneficiaries, and empowered decision makers within the digital economy and society. So the renewal and update of this resolution on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet could not be timelier. The private sector, both companies and investors, are arguably key actors driving digitalization. Digital technology companies in particular are now among the world's largest, commanding and attracting unprecedented capital. This year, 8 of the 10 largest companies in the world by market capitalization are digital technology companies. It's been a change. We now have Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Tencent, Alibaba, and the Taiwan Semiconductor Company. Other companies focused on hardware and telecommunications, such as Samsung, AT&T, Verizon, Huawei, and Foxconn, are also among the world's largest in terms of revenues. In fact, I can only count with one hand or less the number of sovereign states which can boast a gross domestic product greater than the market cap and revenues of the likes of these companies. So what I'm trying to say here is that these companies and others in the digital sector dominate the digital economy, and their business practices can accentuate human rights risks and digital exclusion, especially if they neglect to perform due diligence on the risks from their research and development activities, their investments, and their daily operations, or neglect to remedy when rights violations occur. The UN Human Rights Council resolution recognized this as it recalled the responsibility of business enterprises set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. While digital technologies can be applied towards the achievement of most, if not all, sustainable development goals, it will require the transformation of the current system for innovating, producing, and distributing digital goods and services towards one that is genuinely inclusive and trustworthy. This is the reason that the World Benchmarking Alliance is building a movement to incentivize greater private sector contribution to sustainable development. To encourage a race to the top in the digital sector, we are publishing a free and publicly available benchmark, which ranks and scores 200 of the world's most influential technology companies, I would say from Adobe to ZTE, including Zoom, which we are on now, on their commitments, disclosures, and actions towards 4 broad requisites for inclusive and trustworthy digitalization. These include enhancing universal access to digital technologies that doesn't leave behind low income, rural, disabled, elderly, minorities, women and girls, and many other intersectional categories of vulnerable groups. Improving all levels of digital skills and school connectivity, fostering trustworthy use that respects human rights, especially those of children online, and ensuring, finally, we forget this often, that digital innovation is open, ethical, and inclusive. The findings from the first round of the digital inclusion benchmark were truly concerning. As Mark has mentioned, we found, for example, that only 16 of the 100 companies assessed in 2020 demonstrated a high-level commitment to child online protection. More hardware manufacturers and telecommunication providers had leading practices, while large platforms and software service companies were lagging. While companies may have a number of activities contributing to child online protection, from educational initiatives to reporting child online abuse and cooperating with relevant authorities, we find that these actions and efforts can be better scaled and sustained if there is prioritization at the highest governance body for the company. An example that stands out is the 2017 decision by the board of Sweden's Telia to focus on children's rights. And from what the ambassador said, we can guess that this is highly motivated by Sweden's national focus on business and human rights. The lack of attention, another concerning finding, the lack of attention to the ethics of deploying artificial intelligence is another alarming finding from the benchmark. Again, this is a pattern. Only 16 of the 100 companies assessed could show and demonstrate that they do have a policy to apply AI in an ethical way. And even more alarming is that, again, platforms and software service companies lag behind hardware and telecommunications. So we are seeing a pattern in the industry. International policy frameworks and national regulations are certainly needed to create a market environment geared towards inclusive and trustworthy digitalization that respect human rights. The WBA is very encouraged by and supportive of the efforts to renew and strengthen the resolution on to promote, protect, and the enjoyment of human rights on the internet and others like it. We hope our free and publicly available corporate benchmarks complement ongoing efforts on international digital cooperation and policy reform and counterbalance dare I say, corporate power with a mechanism to create greater transparency and accountability on digital inclusion and human rights performance of these largest companies. So we are at your service. We hope policymakers, companies, civil society organizations, investors, and other actors can make use of the framework, data, and findings in order to take actions to move us towards a world where everyone, coming from someone, I myself am from a poor country, I would say where everyone has equal say in the shaping of our digital present and future. Because it is then and only then that the enjoyment of human rights on the internet have meaning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord, for the excellent overview of some quite stark findings there. I mean, it's called the benchmark, but I think it's also hopefully a baseline from which all of these companies can improve what they're doing, because it sounds like they really need to. And I mentioned that in the introduction, the role of partnership with private sector is really crucial. And to be honest, we don't see enough of that here in Geneva. So I will now turn to the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. I should say it's great to have you here. You know, we do a lot of work at the Universal Rights Group on the intersection of human rights and the digital world. And one of the things we've never really touched on enough, I think, is the issue of cyberbullying and exploitation and violence against children online, which has, you know, all of us know, because we've heard stories from friends and family of the consequences of this for children growing up in the digital world. So it's really good to have you here. So I have a couple of questions for you. You have about 5 or so minutes to answer both. The first is, can you explain how the protection of the rights of children online connects with your mandate as UN Special Rapporteur, and share your thoughts on the role of the private sector in that regard? So we could start with that one, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me clearly? So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am very delighted to be participating in this very, very interesting and relevant discussion and webinar. The issue of ensuring the human rights of children online has never been more pressing than it is now. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children, it's important for me to highlight what my mandate requires me to do. It requires me to analyze the root causes of sale and sexual exploitation of children, identify new patterns of the phenomena, exchange good practices to combat it, promote measures to prevent it, and make recommendations for the rehabilitation of child victims of sale and sexual exploitation of children, all the while integrating a gender perspective throughout my work. And of course, my work is carried out through country visits, thematic studies, advocacies, and communications to government and companies. I also want to highlight the fact that there are different manifestations of sale and sexual exploitation of children, and one of such manifestation is the exploitation of children online. Now, one of the themes I decided to focus on during my tenure in Office of Special Rapporteur is on the sale and on the sexual abuse and exploitation of children facilitated by ICT. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the ever-increasing risk of sexual exploitation and abuse of children online through communication technologies. While online child sexual exploitation and abuse is not a new phenomenon, the last 30 years has seen an increase in the use of the internet and new technology as tools to facilitate the commission of illegal activities to sexually and commercially exploit children anonymously. We have technologies such as live streaming services, encrypted communication systems, peer-to-peer platforms, anonymous payment applications, and these have posed a challenge for law enforcement officials and advocates who often find themselves outpaced as they seek to combat the ever-changing criminal threats against children. Now, the need to ensure and protect the rights of children online cannot be overemphasized. And the recently adopted general comment on the rights of children in relation to the digital environment explains how state parties can implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to the digital environment and promote guidance on relevant legislative, policy, and other measures to ensure full compliance with their obligations under the CRC and optional protocols in light of the opportunities, risks, and challenges in promoting, respecting, protecting, and fulfilling all children's rights in the digital space. It's also important to know that ensuring and protecting the rights of children online requires a holistic approach from all stakeholders. And that is why we're here, because we need to include parents, we need to include teachers, governments, businesses, the civil society, UN system in this endeavor. Governments are state parties to international and regional human rights instruments must formulate or update their laws, policies, and programs to ensure the protection of the rights of children online. There also needs to be a provision of adequate budgetary allocation for the implementation of those laws and programs, together with well-trained and equipped law enforcement agencies, as well as education and awareness raising programs for children and members of different communities on the risks that exist and on how to protect children online and how to keep them safe online whilst ensuring and protecting their rights online. Now, since we're in this forum, it's also important to highlight that businesses also have a very important role to play, not only in the respect of children's rights, but also to prevent and remedy the abuse of those rights in relation to the digital environment. All businesses, large and small, should commit to and comply with the guiding principles on business and human rights to ensure that the processes that are put in place that would identify, prevent, and mitigate potential impact on human rights, specifically those rights that activities that violate the rights of children, especially as it relates to the design of their products, as it relates to the design of their services, as well as in their operations. It is important also to note that through collaboration and cooperation, we have already heard it said here, amongst stakeholders, is important to harmonize practices and procedures, to share expertise and to scale up good practices and provide technical assistance and support to states for the development of legislations, for the development of policies and strategies that would effectively combat and prevent sexual exploitation and sale of children online. In addressing and protecting children online, we must work together. It requires a holistic approach, and it also requires cooperation and collaboration amongst all of us, amongst all stakeholders. And we can only succeed if we work together. I hope that addresses all the questions raised, Mark. Thank you.
It does indeed. It was brilliant. You answered both questions, even though I only asked the first one. So that's the very definition of efficiency right there. I actually have a follow-up question, which you could think about, and then we'll maybe return to it during the Q&A because we're already slightly behind time. And that is, you talked quite rightly about the importance of collaboration and the role of the private sector and government. And you talked about your mandate. So I'd be interested to hear later about the degree to which you have had conversations with governments, but also with businesses about some of the issues that we're talking about today. Okay, I will now turn to Philippa, who again is from the Global Child Forum. Philippa, welcome to you. First question, and then I'll ask the second one after.
Okay, duly noted.
Okay, so how can benchmarking organizations work with the private sector, governments and other stakeholders to address issues around child online protection? Please, Philippa.
Well, thank you, Mark. And also thank you, World Benchmarking Alliance. I think that corporate transparency and benchmark is a driver for not only corporate problem solving and improvements, but also for informed decision makings among all stakeholders. And those stakeholders could be financial actors that we've heard, governments, consumers, even competitors and peers. And that is why we at Global Child Forum, we feel that WBA is such an important initiative, represented here today by Lourdes and Ryan, for example, because I think it channels our and companies' efforts in promoting the SDGs. But we are also in Global Child Forum a benchmarking actor. For the past 11 years, we've benchmarked more than 2,600 companies on children's rights and the business principles. And I think it's a very, very powerful tool to benchmark. You can make the actual benchmarking available in a very easy way. And that is something that we do. For example, we make it available to financial sector. So our studies and the data behind it is available for financial actors to make decisions that based on the findings. And we find that they're very interested in it because we've done correlation studies. In our case, we focus on a wide approach to children's rights, and we see a correlation between our highest scores companies and a higher profitability. We also make the benchmark data available to companies themselves. We do it in a very positive way. We can provide the data, only the data, but also data and best practice performance from peers. And in our opinion, this possibility to kind of measure yourselves against peers is an extremely powerful tool for change. So we try to optimize the tools and guidance that we provide to help these companies to minimize operational risks, but above all, maximizing their positive impact on children. And that is something that we see in general, that companies in our study, focusing on digital inclusion and digital rights, but also in a wider scope, they focus on child labor. And beyond that, not many companies have a very strategic approach trying to maximize their positive impact, for example, through products and services. And this is something that we want to address because, for example, we are launching a business academy this year in addition to our other products and services that we have. And the business academy is focusing on the tech and telecom sector. So we've revised more than 250 companies in the sector this year, and we will provide all of those companies that wish to with their individual scorecard. And the Business Academy is about peer-to-peer learning, solving your children's rights challenges together and with the help of us as experts. And we've already seen a big interest in the sector, which is extremely hopeful.
Thank you very much for that. The second question is in some ways very simple, then probably answering it is very difficult and you'll need to be nuanced, but through all the work you're doing, the benchmarking, the engagement with businesses, do you have a positive overall view of the direction of travel, an increased commitment on the part of businesses, or are things maybe actually going backwards, either overall or in certain sectors?
I would say that we have not, we don't have a clearly positive outlook, but we don't have a clearly negative outlook either. I would say that the sector, as previous speakers have identified, has an enormous potential in positive impact on children. We've seen here for the past year that almost 100% of our children's education have been serviced through technology and tech providers. It's a huge responsibility, but it's also an enormous untapped potential. When we look at what you measured, you asked us, what have we seen? Well, we've measured these companies for more than 10 years. We've measured all the big ones and many of the small ones as well. And we clumped together the tech and telecom sector. So we see, and the interesting part, I think, is that there is a big difference between the two. Telecom companies in general score quite highly, and they are particularly good at developing product and service safety in general. And sometimes they also include child well-being in product development, which is really very nice to see because this goes beyond child labor. The telco sector are also in some instances real pioneers, and that is when it comes to child participation that was mentioned earlier by Lourdes, I think. Child participation in product development, that is not only good for children, but it's also smart by companies because, as we've just mentioned, children or children's parents are often the clients. So in a recent publication that we released on child participation and a how-to guide, Telia, for example, has done this strategically for a couple of years, and we also show it in that publication. I'm also extremely happy to be here together with Andrew from Singtel. Andrew is a company that scored actually highest in the sector in our latest benchmark last year. And we've highlighted that in our report. And it's such a pleasure to be here next to such a company that takes such a radical and strong-minded approach to protecting children. But that is the positive part. And I would say, I think in general, that is true. But we also see a kind of a complex situation when the technology companies in the same sector score low. As in a general, they score low on basic governance to protect children, but they also scored low as a group, of course, in terms of developing products and services with children's well-being in mind. Their products and services may already promote or harm children, but it's not something that is strategically taken into account. And we see that this is worrying, specifically because of the situation of children's education at the moment. But as I said, the fact that it's not done yet, is a really big untapped potential for the sector to include a child participation, child perspective and child participation in product development. And I think when they do this, because I think I hope it's going to be soon, they will be supporting both themselves as well as the young users of their products.
Thank you very much, especially like the point about involving children in product development. As you said, it makes sense from a child rights perspective, but it also makes business sense.
Yeah.
And you know, that's a very important message if we want more and more businesses to be able to go down this path. You also mentioned Andrew from Singtel and Optus, which leads me very nicely to Andrew. Andrew, welcome to you. My first question, and again, you have about 5 minutes to answer 2 questions. The first one is, what actionable role can corporates play in supporting the resolution on human rights in the internet? And how can this help advance the SDGs as well? Quite a UN-y complex question, so I hope you're familiar with all of this UN jargon, but please, Andrew, over to you.
Well, not at all. Thank you very much, Mark, and everyone for having me here. I suppose it's quite interesting and very good to hear that the telco industry is leading the way or trying to lead the way. The Singtel Group, you know, it's a combined subscriber base of over 700 million customers, not just Singapore and Australia, but Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, India. And these are all locations that actually have a lot of child rights issues. And maybe as a bit of background, how as a company, we started to engage into this area of children well-being and indirectly rights. We never used the word rights per se initially, but the well-being of children. As I took on this role in 2013 and we started to engage, you know, with government, with education institutes to try and understand what are some of the issues of concerns with our industry, it was very quick and very clear that despite all the great benefits of the telco industry and the internet and bringing mobility to the populations, that our industry had a lot of what I call the unintended consequences and risks through digitization and having more people on the internet world. So very early in 2013, we established a strategy to try and enable children and youth to strive, to belong, to thrive in a digital world through digital enablement and partnerships. And in a way, these 4 themes has represented how we and perhaps other companies can approach the topic of children rights. So in the area of strive, it's really a focus on enabling the education and knowledge of children and their caregivers on the issues of safety, well-being, cyberbullying, digital addiction. And, you know, we've rolled out programs such as the Singtel Cyber Wellness Program in schools, the Optus Digital Thumbprint Program, to really educate schools, teachers, and parents how to be safe and responsible in the internet. In the area of belong, which is what's mentioned, the issue around accessibility and the digital divide, it's really how do we give access to children as a right of access to knowledge, information, and opportunity, but to do it in a very safe way. So examples of programs in Australia, we have a program called Optus Digital Thumbprint, which we actually work with our customers to have them donate their unused mobile data, where we match it, and we then work through charities to make available mobile services to low-income, vulnerable youth and families and children which have no internet access. And when we launched it in 2019, when COVID hit, it just turned out to be such a phenomenal offering that turned out to engage our broader customer base into helping spread digital inclusion. Now, of course, we also overlay safety products. You know, we have a product called the Singtel Surf School, which provides all the proper filtering, protection that family parents can include. And even products, recently we launched a service called Optus Pause, which allows parents to actually disconnect all their family's mobile devices so that they can spend family time, right? So even services that stops the use of the internet, we see as supporting the well-being. The third area, we call it Thrive, which is really because we are in a digital technology company. How do we enable the rights of children and youth and other vulnerable segments through digital enablement? Examples, we do work very extensively across the region with social impact startups that are developing, you know, technologies that enable remote and mobile education, e-health for children and other vulnerable segments. We even have a startup we've worked with in Australia to create digital enablement for domestic violence that allows children to very rapidly alert trusted caregivers, family, friends, members, etc., during times of domestic violence. And the last area is really about partnerships. And we've always taken a view that the issues we're confronted with can't be solved alone, even as large as a company like Singtel. So we've always forged all our programs through partnerships with government. For example, in Australia and in Singapore, we would host roundtables that combines e-commissioners, the human rights commissioners in Australia, the schools, non-profit organizations to come together to discuss and identify what are the issues and the opportunities that we can collectively address. Another form of partnership we have is with like an organization called DQ Institute, which has created the world's first standard for digital intelligence, endorsed by IEEE, which provides a framework for assessing the holistic skills, digital knowledge of children and youth. So these are just some examples of how we've approached it in the 4 quadrants, which again, companies can take an opportunity to look at it in that way.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, it's incredibly inspiring. So congratulations on all of the work you've been doing. It was interesting to hear that it all started by looking at what some of the unintended consequences in your sector were, and then it was essentially a case of problem solving, but obviously with a very strong human rights, child rights guidance leading you. The second question then is about benchmarks. How useful essentially are benchmarks like the WBA, like the GCF, in terms of helping you advance human rights and children's rights agendas within the company? And is there some way that big international institutions like the Human Rights Council could also be leveraged to do the same thing, basically? Please.
Yeah, I think there are at least 3 benefits that we've found through, benchmarking. One is, I believe every company is on the journey, regardless of where they are in the journey of children's rights and human rights. Despite all that we've done, we are still learning. And sometimes benchmarking frameworks have provided us, for example, a more structured, logical way and systematic way of how we can think about a particular topic like children's rights or human rights systematically. Even while we may have a particular view, the framework actually is very powerful. A second area is really that it's allowed us to identify other better or best practices that we can learn from, not necessarily even within our industry, but other industries. So, as an example, we've always in the past treated children's rights as a subset of the broader human rights. And in fact, through some recent benchmarking with the Global Child Forum, we identified there's actually an opportunity to dial up the visibility of children's rights on its own, even while it's a part of human rights. And right now we're actually taking the input and the insight and slowly working towards enhancing a standalone policy statement for children's rights, because we think that will really dial up visibility and accountability, not only within the organization, but also within the extended value chain and supply chain of partners that we work with. And I think the third area of benchmarking we found very beneficial is this is not a competitive thing. In fact, when you benchmark, you identify, again, the common framework allows us to identify common interests of other organizations. And sometimes it's that common interest that actually results in collaboration for collective action. So these are at least the 3 benefits we've seen from just undertaking and engaging in benchmarking.
Thank you very much, Andrew. The part about the Human Rights Council we can come back to afterwards. Okay, from one Andrew to another, we're now going to move to Andrew Mawson from UNICEF. Hello, Andrew. Well, hello again, because we already spoke at the beginning. So the first question then to you is, what kinds of efforts are needed to address the evolving challenges in protecting children online? And how has COVID-19 further extenuated the role of the industry? Please, Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks to the organisers for inviting us to be here today, and of course greetings to all the participants wherever you may be. You will be probably pleased to hear, certainly I was pleased to hear, that many of the previous speakers have actually touched on many of the important points which I was or am going to allude to, and so I don't need to allude to them in quite such depth as I was perhaps planning to, which will help save us a bit of time, I hope. Of course, a really key issue, which the ambassador has touched on, and Mark, you touched on, and Lourdes has touched on, and others, is the whole issue of actual breaking down digital divides. I mean, getting the fact that if we're talking about protection in this wider sense, when the pandemic has closed so many schools, we've had terrible trouble with educational continuity, and actually it's just demonstrated the absolute need, above and beyond what we already knew, for digital divides to be broken down, and for children to have equal opportunity to really actually, in a sense, exercise their rights online, before we start worrying about some of the issues around protection. So I think that's really important. And I think if we look at this from an industry perspective, the Broadband Commission's agenda for action on faster and better recovery after COVID do make some really useful suggestions for what industry should be doing. For example, ensuring connectivity and network continuity, increasing bandwidth capacity, providing network resilience and security, contributing to affordable access through donation of ICT services, as Andrew has just alluded to. I mean, cloud services, software, equipment, and end user devices. And these are all things which industry can play an important role on, but there's a broad public-private sort of combination of issues in there around it. UNICEF and the ITU have an initiative called GIGA, which has been going since 2019, which is really now focusing on connecting every young person to the internet through schools. And it's these kinds of, I mean, initiatives much bigger than GIGA, which are really important for moving that ahead. Now, other things that have been touched on are the more immediately problematic in the sense of or immediately problematic in other ways. So the whole issues around the way that in context of pandemic, we've seen the significance of children being able to access online support and help in contexts where there is risk of violence or abuse. The industry already plays an important role in this respect in terms of helping through online access to services, but it could play an even more profound role, be more ubiquitous in this space. You mentioned that, I think, in your introduction. Of course, and which we've also heard, is that the way that children are now spending much more time connected. And as a result, amidst the informational, social and learning benefits, there's also potentially increased risk of exposure to various different kinds of harm. So, you know, that's another area which I'll get onto in a minute, but another evolving issue relates to children's data protection and privacy, commercial influence, digital marketing, spread of disinformation, etc., etc. The potential amplification of existing discrimination and bias resulting from predictive analytics and things like that. So COVID hasn't invented or created these things, but it's definitely reinforced them. And what we have seen, or what we would be saying, there are sort of 5 key areas where there needs to be action. And in these, if we're looking at it from the perspective, particularly of the private sector, there's a real need, as Lourdes alluded to, for action which involves leadership at a senior level from executives within the sector. So, for example, integration of children's rights considerations into all appropriate corporate policies and management processes. This is very much a kind of what we see coming out of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, 10th anniversary this year, which we're celebrating now. This is very, very pertinent, and an important part of that is actually businesses carrying out impact assessments. And we indeed have developed tools for mobile operators and others to be able to do these kinds of impact assessments. Developing systematic processes to address and combat child sex abuse material. There's action on this. Many people are taking action. Many companies are taking action, but there is a need to make this kind of thing much more systematic and much more profound in being able to head off these kinds of things ending on the web in the first place. Creating a safer and age-appropriate online environment. And here I would really want to put some emphasis on adopting privacy by design principles, for example, where we're not looking at actually what happens after something is there. We're looking at actually how it's designed in the first place, prioritizing solutions that reduce to a minimum the volume of data relating to children. Educating children themselves and caregivers and educators about children's safety and responsible use of ICT, of course, is really important effort, which people are doing, but again, needs scaling up. Promoting digital technology as a mode for increasing civic engagement by young people. And this is a huge area of both opportunity, but also a way of learning, in the sense, digital skills and digital literacy in a way which actually reinforces safety. And I would add one final one, which is that there's a lot of work needed to really, in a sense, work out what actually works in terms of protection in a way which is rights respecting. And this is something where both governments, academics, and the private sector need to really be exchanging information about, because this is actually, it's not always obvious what works, and there are many possible policy avenues which can get taken, which could be quite limiting in relation to children's rights, but also quite ineffective, and actually therefore a waste of money and time and indeed energy if one's actually really seeking to provide protection. So I'll stop at that point on this question.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Actually, you kind of touched on the second question in your response to the first one, but it's very simply, it's about your experience with cross-sector cooperation and you know, the degree to which that is able to help solve some of these problems, as you said, what actually works, and of course to ultimately further the rights of children.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, you know, what do we mean by cross-sector? I mean, it's not just public-private, it's also between different kinds of sort of activities, social services, online technologies, education, and mobile operators or something. I mean, there's lots of different ways of slicing this, and I think it's really important to remember that the distinction between children's online and offline lives is effectively obsolete. I mean, this is a distinction which adults may think about, or people of my generation. But it's really totally obsolete now. I mean, these lives are totally intertwined. So collaboration between public and private sectors and between different kinds of actor is absolutely essential. So for give an example, most violence experienced by children occurs in physical spaces where they live, learn, and play. So while online violence is a serious issue, attention must be paid to identifying solutions that can simultaneously address these multiple forms of violence, because frequently things like cyberbullying are an extension of what actually is happening in offline. You know, so you're going to need to have work which happens with tech companies, but you're also going to need to have work which is happening within schools and within civil society in general. I think I'd like to touch on one really important area, which is the need for transparency. I think we see that according to some reports and measures, the public trust in tech sector transparency has declined very sharply during the pandemic. And greater transparency is absolutely, you know, when we're talking about protection, it's very easy to jump onto the sort of, in a sense, the very emotive issues around violence or abuse and things like that, which are profoundly important. But issues around governance, and data, how is data, personal information, et cetera, how is that being handled responsibly, are absolutely profoundly important infrastructural issues for child online protection. The transparency in ways which actually help disclose information relating to the effectiveness of safety measures, but there's also a whole, you know, this other whole area around data transparency and what uses is this data being put to. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, General Comment 25, captures it when it says that states should require businesses to maintain high standards of transparency and accountability. So this is very much a public-private area of interface. And we see, I think, increasing, I mean, I know there's a lot of, historically at least, a lot of talk about how the tech sector is so fast moving that it's very difficult to regulate, and there's all sorts of dangers of restricting innovation and et cetera, which is all sort of, you know, has elements of truth to it. But I think this is a rhetoric that also needs to be challenged by good quality legislative and regulatory proposals. And I sort of detect some signs that some areas in industry are actually beginning to move to a little bit more in those kinds of directions, but maybe only small signs. Getting meaningful youth participation rights also key. There are very few issues that crystallize the differences in experience and perspectives between generations as to technology. And the fact that most industry and policy leaders who are making decisions don't actually have direct experience of growing up digital, it is a kind of, is actually quite a profound thing. And we need to empower children, as one of the previous speakers has said, to be part of creating solutions. I mean, they have the right to be heard, clearly, but it's also very practical. It's also very much about helping working out what actually works and what actually will create an innovative and constructive internet experience. There's some really interesting initiatives in this space, like the Youth Pledge for a Better Internet, led by Better Internet for Kids, for example, in Europe. The EU strategy on the rights of the child invites ICT companies to, quote, ensure that children's rights, including privacy, personal data information, and access to age-appropriate content, are included in digital products and services by design and by default. We would really like to see stronger regulatory measures in general to support that kind of sentiment. And for example, we see issues like reporting, mitigating, preventing online risk and harm having a clear place in things like the forthcoming EU directive on mandatory I see I've muted myself. I hate to think how long.
Yeah,
anyway,
it was only like 10 seconds, but if you could wrap up anyway.
Yeah, I was just going to wrap up with a comment on ESG monitoring and reporting and how important that is, and getting much more emphasis on online issues actually into that kind of area, which we think is an infrastructural measure which will really contribute.
Thank you very much. And believe me, we got nearly everything. It was just at the end, a gremlin jumped in and switched it off. At least I hope it was a gremlin and it wasn't censorship or something like that. Anyway, we're now going to go to the Q&A with participants. Please, quite a few of you actually now have written questions to panelists, which I will read to them in a second. But if others also have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll do our best to pose them to the panelists. And while you're doing that, we're first going to hear from the US mission to the UN in Geneva, and over to them.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you to the previous panelists. Really interesting discussion today on the role of private sector in protecting children online. The United States strongly supports calls to foster an enabling online environment that is safe and conducive to engagement by all, including children. We are committed to protecting children online who may face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination online. We remain alarmed at the exposure of children to sexual exploitation, peer-to-peer violence online, data breaches, and online bullying, and we endorse the call of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights for all businesses to respect human rights, and we call on businesses to take measures to prevent child sexual exploitation and abuse from appearing on their platforms. And this call extends to the technology firms that sustain mechanisms that enable the exploitation of children for profit. Private sector action is essential to preventing the tackling this issue. And we applaud the growing number of companies that have made public commitments to do so. As a Freedom Online Coalition member, we commit to preserving an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet while respecting human rights of children online. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Howard. That was very succinct, but really powerful. So thank you for that. So now we have the questions. We have 15 minutes. I will read the selection of questions and indicate who they were directed towards, if not directly to. And then you'll each have about 2 minutes to answer the question. So firstly, to Lord. You mentioned, Lord, that telecoms and hardware companies tend to be doing better according to the benchmark, and software and platforms are, as you said, lagging. Regarding the latter, so software and platform companies, do you nonetheless detect a willingness to catch up if we say they're lagging? Is there a political will and an economic will to catch up? Then the question, 2 questions for Mama Fatima Singhatch, UN Special Rapporteur. The first I kind of asked you earlier, which is, you mentioned the importance of partnership and collaboration, but have you had discussions with businesses about some of the issues we're talking about today? And then a second question from Marcus, and that was sexual exploitation of children in the context of travel and tourism has also transformed online. What are your reflections on engaging with the private sector in the tourism industry to assess these particular challenges in the context of tourism and travel? Question to Philippa. You mentioned the enormous untapped, enormous potential of companies, which was a clever way of getting around whether things are going backwards or forwards, by the way. But in terms of unleashing that untapped potential, that's the word, do you have very brief thoughts about how to do it? I mean, we've talked about benchmarks already, but are there other ways that we can try to encourage more businesses to unleash that potential? Then moving to Andrew from Singtel. You mentioned, which was interesting, that you didn't start with human rights. You started just very practically looking what are the challenges. But as you started looking, and this is the question, as you started looking at solutions, did you find the International Human Rights Framework, so the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, did you find these to be useful to you as tools to make progress? And then a second question to you, Andrew from Nelson. Are tech companies or companies such as yours, which as we heard earlier have often more economic power than many small countries, are you also doing work to kind of build the capacity of administrations and authorities in developing countries so that they can work with you to protect children's rights? And last but not least, Andrew Mawson from UNICEF, you kind of asked the rhetorical question, what actually works? And so I was just wondering if in UNICEF, you've done an assessment of the different countries where you're present to see what actually works in those countries, including in the context of partnership between business, the UN agencies, the UN country team, and the government. Okay, lots of questions. Let's start with Lord then, please.
That's an excellent question, Mark. And actually, I encourage everyone to look forward to our second round of results this year, and we will be able to have a quantitative and concrete answer to that question on whether these platform and software services companies will show improvement from last year's results. So that's something to look forward to. This December, we're releasing the results for 150 companies, 50 more companies, including Azer to Zoom. From observation, there has been, if we talk about, for example, high-level commitment to child online protection, there are a few software and companies who are looking at this and have some kind of high-level policy. Very, very few of them. So say of the 16, there are only 2, for example. And I think it requires sort of a cultural shift, because I'm sorry to say that this particular subsector not to insult children, but they are children themselves, if you know what I mean. So I think what we need is to really, instead of move fast and break things, but move fast and fix things. But it will require a lot of coordination. It will require a lot of international cooperation, policy frameworks, work by the Human Rights Council itself and national governments to create the environment that will make that happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I like the comment about children. And anyway, okay, the next two questions were to Mama Fatima Singhatch, with us from somewhere in West Africa. Please, you have 2 minutes.
Singate, Mark, Singate. But in in response to your first question, usually my communications as Special Rapporteur, our communications to government and companies are usually confidential until they're published. But what I can tell you is that most of the companies we have gotten in touch with talked about self-regulations, that they have their internal policies that ensure that, and also their policies regards to their communities to ensure that keep children safe online. But I have also read about communities and councils that have been established by companies in collaboration with governments, advisory councils that where experts come together to discuss on ways of keeping children safe. So these are all ways where companies and governments work together. We do also have national helplines where companies do collaborate with governments in actually making available such services to provide information and protecting children online and keeping children safe online. I hope that answers your first question. Now, with regards to the second question, what I can tell you that, well, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the risk of exploitation of children in different sectors, in its different manifestation. But with regards to how the tourism industry do have a very important role to play, and I continue to emphasize the importance of the guiding principles of business on business and human rights, and how governments and the private sector, particularly the tourism industry, should commit to ensuring that they implement these guiding principles, because it's always important, no matter what happens with regards to your services, the services and the products that are being made available, to ensure that the violations of human rights, particularly the rights of children, are not, the services that they're using are not used to violate the rights of children. So it's important to ensure that we continue to emphasize the importance of these guiding principles for all members of the industries, for all sectors to use and to apply to the letter. I hope that answers your question.
It did indeed, and apologies for completely mangling your name. As I said, it happens to me all the time, so I know it can be very annoying. But anyway, thank you. Great answers and very succinct as well. The next question was to Philippa. Philippa, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sitting here trying to summarize the big question that you asked me, which is how to release the untapped potential from companies in order to protect children online or sustainability in general. And I will either answer that very, very superficially, or I try to answer for real. And I will try to answer for real. And I think the really, really good, the untapped potential is the positive impact on children through products and services. And companies are really, really good at identifying market opportunities, creating products and services and marketing that sell. The problem is that you need to integrate more than just the actual sales position if you want the untapped potential. So you want them to look further. For example, as Andrew mentioned, that they collaborated with clients in order to make internet available to poorer people by using unused data and sharing it with others. That's really, really good for Singtel. But it's also really, really good for the clients that get to share, and the companies or children or people that access the data that was shared. Why did he do that? Well, there are two ways of getting there. One is through risk perspective. And I think in human rights, naturally, we talk about risk, and we talk about violations, and we talk about what can go wrong. And that is one way. It's very powerful because we try to avoid risk. Doing that, we have to make the risk cost. And benchmarking is a really good way of making the risk cost. If you make a mistake, it must cost. Benchmarking can make information available to an effective civil society, to legislation, to PR and media, to consumers and consumer activism, and to financial sector. And all of these actors can punish the company in terms of influencing sales, branding, legislative action, and perhaps, for example, from the financial sector's perspective, increasing prices on credit. This is a really good way. Another way, and that is the really, really big untapped potential, I think, is the opportunities that we lose because companies don't take this into account early. So how can we ask companies to take children into account much, much, much earlier, already when you make products and services? Well, you can get them there by pressurizing them. For example, in climate, you ask companies to show their climate intensity or their climate intensity or productivity for products and services. But you can also just show them that it's possible. And I think this is the really big leap that we have, that capitalism, we think, is, it's not capitalism unless it hurts someone. But that's not right. I mean, if it's not hurting anyone, basically it's an NGO. So I think we need to reimagine what the product and service actually can be, because it can really be increasing profits for the company, but also making life better for clients and societies. Did I make that in 2 minutes? I'm not so sure, but I tried.
You didn't, but it was worth the extra 30 seconds or so. You tried to answer substantively what was a very difficult question. And it was, yeah, I thought it was very convincing. So thank you for that. We've been, by the powers that be, have given us an extra 5 minutes to wrap up these questions. So if that's okay with all the panelists, we'll run to 20 past. The next two questions were to Andrew from Singtel. Andrew, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Mark. So I think the first question was, have we found, all this UN policies, framework tools useful from a corporate? I must say in recent years, especially as we have been enhancing our supply chain risk management, it has been invaluable. Because once we look at deeper into the supply chain, the multi-layers, that's where actually a lot of the human rights policies, frameworks, modern slavery legislations for which we can get access to those frameworks have allowed us to be a lot more structured and systematic. So I'll say definitely so. To the second question of, can tech companies help build capacity? I think for ourselves, probably we've done some areas consciously, some other areas unconsciously. All our programs, we would work through the Department of Education with schools. Some of our online digital learning programs are tools that allow teachers to know how to facilitate the learning and the teaching with students using digital tools, so that actually builds capacity at the teacher's level to be able to build it into curriculum. We work with organizations like the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia in a lot of the collaborations with our programs. Again, by working with these agencies collaboratively, we build knowledge from them, as we also share knowledge with them as they then bring policies and tools and frameworks to other nonprofit or corporates who want to participate in this particular space. And I think the last area, again, I mentioned earlier, DQ Institute, as we have worked with them and globally to establish a global standard of digital intelligence and knowledge, is this sort of frameworks that can actually be used by not only private sector, but departments of education and even governments to think more systematically about not just digital skills from a technical knowledge, but also from an acumen, a responsibility, behaviors, value systems, and do it in a way that's structured and even measurable in terms of the outcomes.
Thank you, Andrew. Also for reassuring me that all of the documents and standards that we work on here in Geneva are useful somewhere in the world. And that's why we produce them, right? That hopefully governments and the private sector as well find them useful as guidance. So it's always reassuring that we are doing something good. And then last but not least, Andrew Mawson, it was a question about, have you done some kind of case study assessments about what actually works?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's so much more that needs to be done on this, and we've done a bit, but we need to do, not just we in UNICEF, but collectively we need to do so much more. So, and what we have found is that actually one of the key things which works is actually getting people to be aware of what the issues are, and so issues like impact assessments do appear to work. I mean, they do work in terms of actually um, the kind of process that Andrew has described, but also many other mobile operators have gone through in particular, but also many other companies, where they've actually had to sit down and think it through systematically. That does really appear to help in terms of actually then creating a playing field where the whole innovation and power of business, entrepreneurial, but I mean, intellectual resources get applied to some of these problems. If we look at technical issues, it gets much more complicated. There's we've done work on, you know, approaches to age verification and what works there, and it's very mixed pictures. We definitely need to do much more on issues about how you create some safety by design, etc., etc. And finally, one area which we have also looked at, which is another important infrastructure element, but is less about, in a sense, directly what works, but it's really important to understand the culture of internet usage. And one of the big challenges that has been and still remains is that actually most information about how children use the web or the internet or online services in general comes from the developed world, with some exceptions. And so we've been running a project now for a few years, which is really trying to look at global internet usage and trying to do the kind of level, bring some of the research on actually what do children actually do to provide insights from different kinds of social and cultural backgrounds, because of course that is also another important factor in what might work, because actually how things operate within the broader cultural environment, you know, when we get beyond the technology side of it or the technical side of it, in terms of actually people's behavior and behavioral change, that's a fundamental element of actually what people actually do.
Thank you, Andrew. Perfect timing, because it's 1 minute to the deadline, but it just leaves me to thank everybody. The speakers, all the speakers were excellent. I thought it was a really engaging and interesting, and that rare thing for the United Nations, interactive discussion. So congratulations and thank you. And also thanks to all of the sponsors, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Permanent Mission of Sweden, the Permanent Mission of the United States, and the Global Child Forum. I certainly learned a lot, and so hopefully those involved in the resolution at the Human Rights Council also learned a lot. And I wish you exactly 20 past. I wish everybody a very nice morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.